So we're going to be taking a look at the useReducer hook. Now this hook is for storing state and is an alternative to the useState hook. So we're going to start off with a simple example and then make a more complex one to demonstrate how to use it. So to start off, we're going to import a useReducer from React and we are going to call it. So useReducer in our component right here. And how useReducer works is you pass it two parameters. And we can see that if we hover over, we can see the signature. We can pass it the reducer, which is a function, which is going to be very similar, if you're or really exactly the same as what you would do in Redux, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, no worries. We're going to go over how that works. And then also the initial state, where you can pass in a function that returns the initial state as well. So the reducer is a function, so I'm going to say const, or we could say function reducer instead if we didn't want to use an arrow function. You'll notice I am creating this function outside of the component here. That's on purpose. This is a function that is pure and we want to stick outside of our component. We don't want to create it inside. Alright, so I have my useReducer here. I'm going to pass in reducer and I'm going to put my initial state. To start off, we're going to do something simple. We're going to do a counter. So my initial state is going to be 0. And again, if we wanted to initialize this, we could with a function. So same thing. And again, same as useState, you'd want to use a function if the initial state was took some time to compute or something like that. Alright, so in our reducer, how it works is it takes two parameters, the current state and an action. So the state is going to be whatever the current value is in the state, and the action is basically a function that gets called, and the value is going to be stored here. So what it looks like is here we're going to return a state value, whatever the value is. In this case, it's going to be count, and then a function called dispatch. So here we're going to say div count is equal to count. We can see the value of count, and then I want to create a button to increment. And we're also going to create a button to decrement. So now what do I put here? I'm going to call dispatch, and I need to call dispatch with some parameters to get this to work. So I'm going to say decrement. So basically whatever I pass to dispatch right here is going to be this parameter and the reducer. So if I were to dispatch 1, action would have the value of 1. If I dispatch 2 here, it would have the value of 2. Now there is a basically best practice or general way you see people using dispatch and reducers like this in Redux. And so we're going to follow that similar pattern. So usually how it works is you would create an object that you pass in, where you pass in a type, which is usually a string. So here is where I'm going to pass a string, and you can make this all caps if you want, or I sometimes just do all lowercase and put it there. You can also, this is something where you can store in a variable. So we could say increment is equal to increment. It really comes down to whatever you want to do there. We're going to just keep it simple and start with here, but you can follow some of the Redux best practices if you like with this. Alright, so we have this object that we're passing in. We set the type increment, and that's really all we need to do. And then here I'm going to say type decrement. So now in my reducer, basically what I do is I read what the action is and I change the state accordingly. Now you can do whatever syntax you want inside of this reducer, but the most common one you'll see is a switch statement where you say action.type. And so here we're going to have different cases. So for example, when we have an increment action passed in, what should we do? Well, we should say return state plus 1. And when we get a decrement state, or action I mean, we're going to return state minus 1. And then here we're going to say default return state. And default is whenever the action is not an increment or decrement, the default thing we should do is just return the state. So let's see what happens when we do this. So now we're going to see as I increment the state and decrement the state changes. And so we basically are listening for these actions that are being dispatched. So this is what you'd call an action. And the different types, we react to them in different ways. All right, so that is the basics of useReducer. So you basically create a function that changes the state A key point with this is you do not want to mutate the state inside of this. So I don't want to do state plus plus. I want to create a new version of the state that is state plus 1. So that's very important. So now the example that we're going to do is we're going to build a small little to-do list to show you some of the different ways that you would use the reducer for this. So now my reducer, I'm going to make it an object, and it's going to have some to-dos in it. It's going to have an empty array by default, and that's what we're going to start with. So now here my state is going to be an object, and state.todos will have this value in it. I can also destructure this if I want to, like that. So what I'm going to start with is an input field, and this input field is going to be basically, we're going to wrap it in a form. This is how we're going to add to-dos to our list. Now, a good thing to note about this is we can mix hooks all we want. So even though I have useReducer here, if I was making this, I would probably just use useState to store the state of a input field. So I'm going to say useState, and I'm going to say text set text. So I'm going to pass the value of the input text there, and then the on change is going to be set text e.target.value. And now when this form is submitted, on submit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new to-do list or new to-do item on here. So I'm going to say e.prevent default value. So if you don't do this, the form will refresh the page. So we're going to do that. And so whenever someone hits the enter key, this is going to add a to-do to this. So we want to say dispatch, and our action is going to be add to do. And the other thing you can note about actions is you can pass in other data in there that you need. So for example, I want to pass in the text. So here I'm going to say text, and that's from the use state. And so now I need to create my reducer to handle this new action that I added, add to do here. And I'm going to go ahead and say pre json.stringify these to-dos. That way we can see what this looks like. We can see our array. So as we add to-dos and hit enter, we should see them displayed here once we add the dispatch for it. I'm also going to set text and clear out the text whenever I dispatch here. So here inside of this, I'm going to say add to do, and I'm going to get rid of decrement. So here I'm going to create a new object. I'm going to say .state, or in this case, since we only have one item, I could just say to-dos, and I'm going to say .state.todos. So I'm going to keep all the existing to-dos, and I'm going to add one on. So I'm going to say text is equal to action.text. The other thing to note is usually you'll usually call this payload, and then the payload you may put different values in. So we could call the payload text, or we could just call it text here. It's good to note that some people name it that way. But I'm just going to call mine text there. So I'm going to say text : action.text. One thing you'll notice if you're familiar with Redux is I tend to do it this way. I'm a little bit looser when I'm using useReducer in a single component than I am if I'm using Redux, and I need to be, following the same convention all over my entire application so it doesn't get messy. I tend to be a little bit looser when I'm just using useReducer, but maybe it's better to be stricter. Just one note I've noticed that I've been doing. And so here I'm going to say completed is going to be false. All right, so let's see this in action now. I'm going to say 1, enter, 2, and we can see our state is growing now as I add items. So cool. So now I want to display these items not like this, but just in a list. So I'm going to say todos.map, and then for each T, I'm going to display a div, and that's going to have the value, so t.text, and the key, I'm going to say t.text as well. So don't put duplicate text, or this is going to get messed up since we're using that for the key. So let's see this now. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and excellent. Those are showing up. Let's go ahead and now add another action. So when I click on the to-do, I want to cross it out. So on click, I want to dispatch a new action that says toggle to do, and I want to do that at a certain index. And our map function, the second parameter is the index. So index, we can pass that right in. So now in my toggle to do up here, I can copy this case, say toggle to do. We're gonna keep, actually we're gonna get rid of this. We're gonna do a totally different way to get this to work. So whenever I need to update the value, basically we need to go through this list and we need to, at a certain position at that index, set completed to false or set to true, basically inverse it. So in situations where you need to update a certain item in a list, the way I like to do it is say state.todos, and I like to map over it. So the map is going to have the to-do value and then the index, and then what I do is if the index is equal to action.index, then I do a ternary, and I know this particular item when I'm mapping over is the one I need to change. Otherwise, I just return the current to do. So here I'm going to say ... to do. So I'm going to keep all those existing values in the to do, in this case just the text. And then I'm going to say completed is equal to t.completed, and then I'm going to inverse that value. So what this chunk of code does here is it's going to iterate through the list of to-dos that we have, and it's going to flip completed. So if the value is true, it's going to go to false, and we do it at a certain index. All right, so let's see that in action. We're not making a visual difference yet, so let's do that so we can actually see the change happening. So here I can say text decoration, and we can say strike. Is it strike through? This may not be right. We'll double check in a second. We're gonna say t.completed is equal to that. Otherwise, it's an empty string. All right, so let's say one click. Yeah, it's not right. So I'm gonna right click inspect here. I'm gonna click on this item, and I'm gonna say text decoration strike. Oh, is it not that? Maybe it's a different one. I thought it was maybe text transform. Nope. It's one of these properties. Text. I thought it was decoration. Oh, it's called line through. All right, so we'll rename that. So this is also, by the way, you get auto completion here. And if you open the inspector elements and then go to styles, that's what I was doing here to try to figure that out. So one, and I click this, you can see it toggles on and off as I click it now. So pretty cool. And so that's the gist of useReducer. You'll have an initial state of some sort. You'll pass a function that's a reducer, and that reducer is going to handle different actions throughout your application, and then you're going to call dispatch to trigger those actions. You're going to pass any data you may have in. You're going to pass a type, and then your reducer is going to handle updating the state. So all your logic of updating the state goes in here. So why do people like using this over use state? What is nice about it? Well, our state here is relatively simple, but when you get into more complex state, it's nice to be able to change multiple things in the state based on actions. So what is an example of that? Well, let's say we also want to store the number of to-dos we have. So maybe the to-do count. So we'll set it to 0. So whenever we add a to-do, we not only want to add something to the to-do now, we also want to increment add to-do, or sorry, to-do count. So now I say state.todo count plus 1. So now you can see, and we should also keep to-do count is equal to state.todo count whenever we toggle the to-do here. So now you can see, and let's actually verify if this works, and then I'll talk more about that. So number of to-dos, and now we can display that. We can destructure it from up here, to-do count. And let me just make sure I didn't say to-dos. Yep, good. All right, so I can say 1, 2, 3, and we can see it's now counting there. So as you can see, as we get more complex state, a single action might map to multiple things in the state changing. And so it's very easy to put that logic in a reducer like this. So for those of you that are wondering when should you use useState versus useReducer, because that's really the question that's going to come up next, because you can use them both for storing state. I have a video that goes more in depth over this question. I'll link it below if you want to view it. But the short answer is whenever your state gets more complex, use useReducer. If something you have is very simple, you can use useState. And I think that's the distinction I usually use. The other thing to note is if you're familiar with Redux, you'll notice this is very similar. So when should you be using useReducer over useRedux? Again, I have another video, I believe, going over that. So I'll link that below as well. But the short answer for that one is if you're using the state in a single component, for example, in this app, I have it all inside of here. I like using useReducer. If you want to use this state in multiple components and they're spread out and that state relies on each other, that's when I like using Redux or another state management library rather than putting useReducer and maybe sticking context with it and trying to spread stuff out that way or passing down props. I much prefer Redux or state management libraries in that scenario. So that's that. One last thing that I wanted to mention with this is you'll notice the logic with this can get quite ugly, especially if this is a very nested object. Having to create a something immutable in that we don't want to change the value of the state is kind of annoying sometimes. So I highly recommend looking at this library called useImmer if this is a problem you have, because basically what it allows you to do is you can mutate the state and basically underneath the hood it'll handle making an immutable change for you. And so this can be very helpful when dealing with large states in reducers, and it works for useState as well. So I highly recommend looking at this if you get some complex useReducer logic. But there you go. That is an introduction to useReducer.